So we're on, and in about 3 minutes, I'm going to hit the live on custom live streaming service.
Excellent.
As I explained to the early comers, Stan, this is the first time I've done this, so I hope I don't totally make a hash of it. Fingers crossed.
Well, as I always used to say prior to 2020, what's the worst that could happen? I no longer say that quite as frequently, I'm afraid.
I want to keep that one to yourself.
It's excellent to panel with you folks. I've paneled with a number of
Likewise.
you before. Yeah. So good to reunite.
Good to see some familiar faces.
Definitely is.
For once.
So I am going to go mute here in a minute. And I think turn off my video as well, but I'll be here. If you need me, you can hit the chat and I'll be watching.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you for taking care of us.
Yeah.
Who's the moderator?
That's me, I think, technically.
Okay.
Paul is marked as the mod.
Paul is the man.
But you guys can sort it out.
So yeah, let's say we'll see how it goes.
I've been on quite a few panels. I know what it's like, so you guys sort it out.
Indeed, we can do
All
that.
right. I'm going to go ahead and hit the live on custom live streaming and leave it up to you guys, but let me know if you need anything.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie.
Yep.
Webinar is now streaming live.
We hope.
Is there a waiting room or?
I don't
No,
know.
everybody's in, they're starting to trickle in with us. I see participants list as a number at the bottom. Folks, if you can hear us, give us a thumbs up. You can hear us in the chat. And I think that'll greatly reassure the panelists.
And your host got an access issue.
Uh-oh.
No, those participants are all us.
Oh, well, there, I see one.
Yeah, we have one attendee, it says. The rest are all us.
And I've lost the Zoom window.
I don't think that counts people who are viewing on Twitch or the web page.
Okay.
So if you are viewing us on Twitch or the web page, there should be a link, I'm told, on the web page whereby you can get to the Zoom meeting if you want. You don't need to. If you do so, then you can actually submit questions through the Q&A function there or in the chat, which we'll be looking at. We'll give folks a moment or two to trickle in before we really start getting into it. But we can start with some introductions. I will begin. My name is Paul Lell, and I am an author of fantasy, science fiction, urban fantasy, and a lot of role-playing games and general game design. And I will, in theory, be moderating this particular conversation, but we generally just play it by ear, so we'll see how it goes. And I'm looking over here at everybody on screen, and my camera's over here, so I'm sorry for the side-on view. That said, let's start at the top of the list and go down for introductions. We will begin with Catherine.
Hi, I'm Kat Valenti. I write fantasy, science fiction, horror, adults, children. Basically, if it can't happen in real life, I write it. Probably the most relevant book of mine for this panel was the Hugo-nominated space opera, in which I created a continent of Europe amount of aliens for that a science fiction comedy story, but there was definitely a process there. I've written more fantasy than science fiction, but I actually think it's pretty much the same process creating fantasy beasties and aliens. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
I would tend to agree. Stant, you're next down on my list.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Stant Latore, located in Colorado. I write science fiction and fantasy, zombies, dinosaurs, aliens, time travel, really anything that gets my adrenaline going and makes me feel playful. Probably the most relevant to this conversation is Ansible, which is about 25th century Islamic telepaths and time travelers and shapeshifters who transfer their minds across space and time and get marooned inside alien bodies. So I had a lot of fun inventing various aliens for that. But I agree wholeheartedly with Kat. Whether you're creating a race of elves, a race of dragons, a race of gods, or a race of mind-devouring aliens, it's largely the same process.
Cool. All right, and then Gary, welcome aboard.
Thank you. My name is Gary Ram. I live in Wellington, Colorado, which is just north of Fort Collins. I usually describe myself as sort of semi-retired, but I write both science fact and science fiction. Recently published my 20th book, which is a twice dead genius comporting with misunderstood abominations. And some of those abominations are aliens, some are human, but anyway, it's the third part of a trilogy. I enjoy inserting humor into my science fiction. And so it's always fun to make up aliens. I have a background in biology, so I've had a chance to explore a lot of the strange things on planet Earth. So it's interesting to try to create some strange things that might be off planet Earth.
Sounds good. And last but certainly not least, we have, is it Van or Aaron or Van Aaron?
It's Van Aaron, but feel free to call me Aaron. That's what people who know me usually call me. I am a Denver author of science fiction and fantasy short stories, a few of which involve aliens. And it occurred to me preparing for this panel that the ones that involve aliens include the story of mine that was a winner in the Writers of the Future contest and a couple stories that sold to FNSF. So those ones seem to do pretty well. I probably should be writing about aliens more than I do.
Am I the only one who's not in Colorado?
I am also in Colorado, so.
Okay, I'm in Maine, so I'm coming at you from the middle. I'm actually on an island in Maine, so I'm coming at you from the Atlantic Ocean.
We appreciate you joining you, and I just wanted to point out part of my library is behind me, including the Cat Valente shelf.
Oh, that's so awesome! Oh, that makes my night.
Nice. Cool. So if you are not aware, this panel is aliens, but make them believable. So I assume we're going to spend some time talking about how we can make aliens believable. And they provided me with some lead-in questions. We'll begin with, how do you interweave science with creating characters that can still interact? So do aliens use base 10 math? How do they communicate? Maybe even questions of morals, sorry. Do they think in the same way we do, or do they have to think in similar ways to be able to interact with us as characters? Some of those things. So I think we'll go backwards this time. So Van Aaron.
I'm not going to offer very many pat answers. I will say, in terms of making aliens believable, I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. Like, intuition tells a lot of people that if they seem familiar and not too different from us, it'll be easier to believe. But I think it's usually the other way around, because if they seem too human, that's inherently unbelievable. The one thing we can be sure of if we ever meet aliens is they'll be very, very different from us. So to me, that's the first key, is thinking on every level in terms of the biology, in terms of the culture, in terms of how they interact. Make sure that they're very different from how we are. And, there can be some parallels that you can build metaphors upon, but to the extent they talk like human beings, and there's a lot of golden age science fiction where this happened before I think people collectively figured it out. There's a lot of golden age science fiction where the aliens act like human beings and have the same concerns we have, and how do I make more money and things, and it falls flat, because you can bet that that's not how they would act if we ever met them.
It does seem unlikely. All the names are moving. Catherine, how about you? I think you're on mute.
Kat, you're muted.
When I was writing space opera, I knew I was going to have to create a lot of aliens. Space opera is Eurovision in space. So the alien species sort of stand in for the countries that participate in Eurovision, which if you don't know what it is, it's a sort of Europe's battle of the bands every year. There's more to it, but I'm not going to get into that here. So I kind of made myself a list of things I wanted to cover. had to have an AI species. I wanted to have a species who's not physically there, who has, you know, projections, avatars the way we do. And I really wanted to have a wide representation of types of life. So the big kind of all-powerful colonial species are actually based on sea squirts, which is one of the simplest life forms on Earth here. But I wanted to take a simple life form and forcibly evolve it into something that could take over the galaxy. There's a species based on red pandas. There is a species that is sort of an amalgamation of a number of bird and fish creatures. But I wanted to have marine life, I wanted to have insect life, I wanted to have life that kind of represented a lot of different ways that sentience goes on our own planet Earth. Because as Gary was saying earlier, biology. The answer to this question is just biology. Give a shit about biology and you will get very far. Everything about us is informed by the bodies we're in. Why do we have base 10 mathematics? We have base 10 mathematics because we got 10. So if you don't have 10, it's more than math that affects. It affects everything. We very much, in very real ways, are our organic containers. And for the space opera gave me a really easy concept to make that point over and over and over again, because the whole book is about music. So what is this alien's music? Music we make with our bodies, not just about singing, but about the instruments that we conceive of and want to play. Music says everything about the case that we find ourselves in. So there's a viral species, it's a sentient virus. And what does that mean? What does music even mean to a virus? Well, it has a lot to do with what you can force the body that you're inhabiting to do. You know, whether you're carbon-based or silicon-based, music allowed me to always have some way to, a baseline to bring this wide variety of aliens back to and what they interpreted music as. So, you know, the viral species ends up with a quite literal earworm that it goes in your ear and makes you so you really, really, really can never forget that song. And that kind of thing, I mean, it's a funny joke, but it's also a very, you know, possibly serious consideration of how an alien species might consider pop music to be disseminated. And so you have to think about all that stuff at the same time, but rooting it in some kind of biology, some kind of real biology that we know about helps so much. And there's so much variation just in life on planet Earth. Just here, just this one little world, you can't imagine how weird fauna can get. And so I really think that just having a grounding in and a real care for biology gets you very far. And that goes for fantasy creatures too, like centaurs. You have to think about, you know, what is a centaur body? All right, well, where's its heart? Up here, or is it where a horse's heart is? You know, even answering that question is going to open up a lot of ideas in your head for what a centaur culture and a centaur character might be like. So that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Totally huge concern. Biology is important. Let's see. Stant, how about you?
Sure. Echoing Kat, absolutely biology. Here's 3 thoughts that are useful. First, in biology, just like in magic, everything comes at a cost. There's an energy cost to everything. And, you know, there's these evolutionary arms races between species. So a very useful thing, whether you're creating a sentient species or a non-sentient species, and we can have a whole conversation about whether we and another species would even recognize each other as sentient. I mean, the majority of human beings today even don't recognize the proto-sentience that scientists are seeing in chimpanzees and dolphins and a handful of other species. So if you took a species that's, I mean, dolphins and chimpanzees share most of our genome. If you took an utterly alien species and we were both sentient, would we even know it? But everything in biology has a cost. So you can think about that on the African savanna, right? You get gazelles with longer and longer and more slender legs. And that comes at a cost because those legs are brittle. Great Pyrenees get bred. You get several breeds of large, massive dogs meant to take down wolves to protect flocks, but the adults get severe hip problems later in life. And Larry Niven and Niven, Purnell, and Barnes The Legacy of Hero, they come up with this creature that's capable, the Grendel, that's capable of these rapid bursts of super ferocity and super speed, and it super hyper oxygenates its blood and can go for 80 miles an hour and take down its prey. But the cost is that this super crocodile cooks itself. So it has to stay very close to water or snow. And there's this lovely dramatic scene where one of the colonists brings out a flamethrower in the middle of the night, and helps this thing cook itself. So whatever abilities you give this alien species that you're imagining, think about what the cost would be. You can imagine an alien species that maybe somehow has the ability to flee danger by leaping 5 minutes into the future. And the way you make it believable is by thinking through the mechanics of that. What is the cost? What has that alien species had to give up in order to do that? Second of the three thoughts is, what are this thing's primary senses? We think so much in terms of sight and sometimes hearing, but what if your alien species, its primary sense is olfactory, or its primary sense is tactile, or its primary sense is radio signals, or it gets around through echolocation? Or what if it's not fauna at all? What if it's flora? What if the species you're creating is descended from something analogous to plant life, or is fungal in origin? Then its senses might not map to our five senses at all. So that can be some really creative and playful things to think through. And then third, the third of my three thoughts is a really useful exercise that I think for young writers to like really push their imaginations, is to start with the Fermi paradox, and kind of attack it in reverse. So Fermi was a nuclear physicist who said, okay, why haven't we encountered aliens? Mathematically speaking, even at the slowest amount of interstellar flight, a sentient spacefaring species could cross the Milky Way within a few million years. And the Milky Way is a lot older than that. So are we the first? Or is there some other reason that we haven't made first contact? Why does SETI not get answers? And so if you approach that by thinking about aliens as nothing like human, and maybe nothing like mammals, maybe even nothing like insects, and you think, well, and you sit down one day and say, let me come up with 30 reasons why sentient spacefaring species why we wouldn't be contacted, why we would pass each other in the night. And that can be a really powerful creative exercise. What if you have these armadillo-like species, not in terms of their biology, but in terms of their physical appearance, that are that communicate in a highly sophisticated way through sense. And they put out these perfumes. And when we encounter each other, because we're not putting out scents that make sense, that are coherent and have a grammar to them, these aliens don't recognize us as anything other than scenery. And we don't recognize them as sentient life. And 1,000 years from now, our children are riding the backs of these things in parks, not realizing that these things have this powerful intergalactic civilization going on all around us.
That has all kinds of implications to it. All right, cool, thank you. And Gary, what are your thoughts?
Well, you mentioned earlier about integrating science fact with science fiction and aliens and so on. And of course, one of my passions has always been paleontology. So when I started writing this last fictional trilogy that I've been working on, the protagonist was a human paleontologist, and he was searching in Cretaceous sediments and ended up coming across a artifact among the ribs of a mosasaur. And when he touched the artifact, he was infected by this alien who had actually come to Earth during the time of the Cretaceous, but had suffered the asteroid impact, of course, that destroyed Earth's ecosphere at that time. And so in order to preserve themselves, they preserve themselves as engrams in these spheres. And so the first story involves an infection by this kind of an organism. And in order to create the organism, I decided that it would be kind of cool to have an alternation of generations. And if you, I don't know, harken back to your days in biology class, the idea that you have a gametophyte generation, which has a haploid set of chromosomes, and they mate, produce an egg, which grows up into a diploid organism. And so for the Grovians, I had this alternation of generations kind of critter, which was kind of fun to develop. In the second book in the series, was a little different premise. And in that one, a human genius was on his deathbed. When his, after he died, his doctor was rather unscrupulous and captured his brain patterns and put them into an AI who was designed to kind of preserve his essence and so on over time. And then the human race suffered an asteroid impact that destroyed human civilization. And when he wakes up a million years in the future, he finds that some aliens have come to Earth that I call Jatterbatians, and they have a insect life cycle in which the form which lives the longest actually is the kind of a larval type form that doesn't reach sexual maturity until they've lived for several hundred years. And on their planet, they had a primate sort of critter that they thought made excellent pets. When they arrived on Earth, they kind of assumed that humans, since by that time civilization had simplified considerably, were pets. And so I had a lot of fun developing that concept. Would this be a good time to share a couple of slides that I had?
Yeah, it's fine if you want to throw some up, or I have them ready as well if you'd like me to put them up.
All right, well, let me see if I can use the shared screen here.
Cool. So that while that's going on, if folks want to kind of think about, are there limits to the believability? Like, where do you draw the line if you're trying to use aliens in a storytelling context?
This is 2020. There are no limits to believability. You just have to have, it has to be logical, it has to be thought out. There has to be a reason for it.
I completely agree with that. I mean, especially given that people are really no longer quite so hyperactive about what's hard and soft science fiction and all of that these days. As long as you have backed it up with something that both feels true scientifically and emotionally, people are fine with almost any alien. I mean, one that I always keep in mind is Douglas Adams throwing off a idle joke about a hyper intelligent shade of blue. Like, you know, you could come up with a way in which that works, you know, some kind of sentience carried along the light spectrum. I don't see any reason that you couldn't hand wave that into existence. And if you can hand wave that into existence, you know, sky's the limit, quite literally.
But I think that's the question. How much hand waving do you need to do to justify that? I think it was easier for Douglas Adams to get away with that, or get away with the Babel fish, because everyone knew it was primarily meant to be a silly, funny story, and it worked. If you were writing a more serious story, I think you'd have to be more careful putting in a story element like that you didn't take the time to justify.
But I think that you could probably get away with a single line about the light spectrum and move on from there. It really does, as you say, depend on your subgenre. I mean, if you are writing hard science fiction, mundane SF, as used to be what they called that, then yeah, you're probably going to have to spend a little time justifying that. But, you know, kind of middle of the road, it's okay to not get into the nitty gritty of how the FTL drive works. I don't think you need more than a line or two. So I think that you can really get away with a lot, but it does depend on your subgenre, and there are going to be ones that are a little harder.
As long as you do the work, right? If you think of Stephen Baxter is one of the hardest of hard sci-fi. It's basically a half novel and half mathematical textbook when he's writing it. But he comes up with these extravagantly alien species, but he takes the time to do the work. Or David Brin, a bit softer, but some of the species he comes up with in like Brightness Reef are really extravagant. They're not things you would think at face value would be believable, right? The Jakeks are aliens that have wheels instead of legs. And the reason is because they've been genetically engineered to work on suborbital platforms. A lot of things are believable. I guarantee that no matter how strange we imagine species, if we were actually to encounter a non-terrestrial biology that doesn't share any roots with ours, it would be stranger than what we're imagining.
Sure. Cool. Gary, walk us through what you got here.
All right, is it showing up all right on the screen?
I got it here.
All right. Well, anyway, the tree in the cover cover of the book on the right is the diploid part of the generation of these Grovians, and there's a human at the bottom, along with a a Grovian ambulus on the right, which is the haploid part of the generation. But the background that I've got for that I'm using now shows kind of a mother tree forest, which has taken root on Earth after the Grovians survived 2 asteroid impacts, both the one that destroyed the dinosaurs and the one that destroyed human civilization. So this kind of is an image of what Jatterbatians look like on the right. And someone mentioned earlier the fact that smells and shifting colors and so on, and a variety of different communication styles may happen with various alien organisms. And in the case of the Jatterbatians, they have kind of a cuticle. It's almost like a squid that shifts colors and so on. And smell becomes a much more important part of their biology.
I love the title.
And yeah, the second book, A Once Dead Genius in the Kennel of Master Mortigue Ambergrand, involves Rudy, who is the once dead genius who survives with his AI contact into 1 million AD. He ends up sort of parasitizing a distant relative of his who comes in contact with an old Jatterbatian that's just about ready to metamorphose, and Rudy and this elder Jatterbatian go through a metamorphosis together. It's interesting, someone earlier was talking about the distances that we have to deal when we're talking about interplanetary and systems and the possibility of different forms of life actually meeting. And one of the sobering things, for example, are the Viking probes, which have now exited the area of our solar system, but even traveling at 3 times the speed of a bullet are going to take 70,000 years to get anywhere near to the nearest star. And so those are one of the things that Rudy and his Jatterbatian companion have to ponder. But anyway, this gives you an idea of the life cycles that I developed for these particular aliens. And it's fun to, as Kat mentioned, the variety of life on Earth is enormous, and all kinds of things have been tried. And so one of the people who influenced me quite a bit as a biologist was Lynn Margulis, who made a point of showing how often cooperation among living things is just as important as competition. And many times there were whole biological systems that were kind of co-opted from one organism to another. And that ends up being part of the plot line in the Abomination book, where some alien liaisons happen, which gives them some interesting powers. But of course, a lot of times in science fiction, the aliens are kind of a stand-in for human beings, and you want to say some things about human interactions. And you can do that in the case of aliens, and people don't mind so much. It's, I guess, the reason for the original black on white kiss in the Star Trek series and so on, where you can do a lot of things as long as it's in outer space. You're talking about aliens that you couldn't do otherwise. So it's fun to be able to develop these critters.
Yeah.
Unshare the screen there.
See, am I still on share or off now?
You are, yes.
You're still sharing.
I really love that you're doing a lot of the construction of your species around life cycles, because this is one of the most fascinating thing about terrestrial species is life cycles. So I need to read your books, Gary.
So there's a question they have here that kind of, I don't know that the question itself is something we need to discuss. We've already talked about a lot of it, but it does raise an interesting question of culture, right? So to a point that Gary just made, science fiction has classically been used to sort of slip lessons or social commentary, as it were, past people's censors. You know, you start telling a story of, moral decision making, or again, cultural happenings in the context of science fiction or alien life forms, that sort of thing. And people are more readily able to accept that, I guess, into the zeitgeist. To what extent do you guys think that the culture of an alien race is critical to the telling of the story, or even the fleshing out of that species or its presence in the universe? Where do we go last time? We'll start with Kat.
Well, I mean, to me, the culture is really key. I'm interested in alien bodies, but I'm a lot more interested in alien lives. And culture involves every aspect of our lives. I am always disappointed when there's just a great oogly boogly monster and I don't know anything about their culture. I mean, the classic example of that is Independence Day. Like, really? All right, so this is the alien that has created an interstellar society, an entire military culture, all that stuff. Cool. So, what do they do on Saturday when they're home? Like, not everybody in a culture, any culture, even Spartan culture, can just be slavering military monsters. Like, there has to be a support system for a military fleet like that to work. So who does the laundry? They clearly don't wear clothes, but like they will use things that need to be washed. Who does that? What's poetry in this culture? Even if they don't create anything like human poetry, anybody who gets far enough on the civilization skill tree is going to have some kind of artistic expression. What do these guys have? Or did they just eat all of those? This is actually something that I have an entire chapter talking about in Space Opera, and it's just it's something that happens a lot in movies because there's not a lot of time, and so I'm extra disappointed when it happens in books, because you got all the time in the world and you are not held back by any kind of CG budget. You can do anything you want, so you have time. Everybody's got time to do culture for their aliens, and to me it really is key, and that starts at the linguistic level. You can talk about Delaney and Lecky and gendered pronouns and how they use those to great effect in order to inform a very different alien culture. But of course, it cannot be so alien that it makes absolutely no sense to the reader. You are still creating a fictional world that has to say something valuable to the human being that is reading it. And so there is a delicate balance to be had there between creating something that isn't just a Star Trek alien and has the cultural equivalent of a prosthetic jammed on their forehead and call it a day. But at the same time, you don't want something that is so crazy that you can't make head or tails of it. So it is actually kind of delicate, but I am always frustrated by not having enough of a window into the culture of a species, to the religion of a species. And of course, a species doesn't necessarily have to have religion, just because we think of these as the basic cultural units: art, religion, family, reproduction, these kinds of things, are the building blocks of culture. It doesn't mean that that is for the alien, but you got to fill in what the replacement is for the reader, especially if you're looking for the reader to have some kind of emotional attachment to these aliens, some kind of reaction to them other than, run away. It really is key to getting people to feel like that alien is not only real, but something that they can connect to. And again, we go back to, this is science fiction. Cultural anthropology is a science, and the work has been done for you to understand what the building blocks of the various different cultures, even on this planet, are, and how different they can be, even when we do all have the same bodies. So if you study cultural anthropology, it is easier to extrapolate. In space opera, one of the species, the one that isn't really there, they're basically a species of gamers. Their whole culture is built around this particular game that nobody else understands how they get points in this game. But every once in a while, a number will appear above the head of one of these little avatars, and they have done something that scored points in this game. They're very secretive about this game, and the game is what fuels their travel all through the galaxy. And you're in trouble when the little objects that serve as projectors for their avatars start showing up on your planet. We sold them as pet rocks on ours, obviously. But even just something as simple as that is probably the simplest, most like throwaway joke sense of a culture. They're all playing this massively multiplayer online game at all times. Nobody else really understands what's going on, but they've all got skins and avatars. So that connects to something that the human readers understand. Almost every science fiction fan will understand all those words I just used. Something that they do in their own lives and generally think is kind of cool, but they can extrapolate that to what would it be like if the entire culture was playing one particular game. It is different than human culture, but not so different that it's completely alien. And I don't have to get too far into it to have a character moving further around that culture, and you can hold on to what they're saying and attach it to what I have already revealed. That's probably the simplest one unit of culture ever, but it still works. And other than a science fiction comedy book, you do probably want to have more than one cultural through line. But since I have over 40 species of aliens to get through, I had to move through quickly. So it's things like that, considering what a culture might be if it were built around something different than what our culture is.
And as we all know, it's important to not kill off all the telephone sanitizers.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you're writing sentient species, then I'd say whatever this cool, think about biology and culture as very, biology, culture, and environment as things that are tightly interwoven and interacting and determining each other. And that can give you a lot of clues. So if you alter, if you have a species whose biology is not human, how does that impact their motivations and their fundamental drives? And then ask, what does my alien, if you have human characters and alien characters, then what do they have to learn from each other? What does my reader and the alien characters have to learn from each other? If you are writing a species that is more analogous to hive insects than to mammals, often science fiction has gone the direction of making those the bug-eyed monsters, but there's a lot more you can do with that. Orson Scott Card started to flip that in Ender's Game, when suddenly we had this remarkable empathy for the Queen, and we got a completely different window into why this war was happening and what the species was about. If you have, maybe you have this character in your book who is a drone or a warrior, or the analogy to a worker ant, and they're dry, they don't have either the primate individualism that humans do, nor the primate yearning for tribal community that humans do. They're fundamentally driven by pride in their work and the desire to make something beautiful, not as self-expression, but as a contribution to the whole. And they're driven by this passionate loyalty to the Queen. So then what you ask is, you could treat that as this hugely other thing, but you could also say, what is admirable in that, and what is that, how does that remind your human reader and your human characters of certain drives that are located in our primate biology that are important to us, but that we often fall short of? Where are those points of connection, and what does the human reader or character learn from that very different worker ant creatures driving loyalty to their queen, to their love, their distant love that they'll never see, or to their forever pursuit of a beauty, creating a beauty that they don't own. If you're C.J. Cherryh and you're writing The Pride of Chanier, there you're dealing with a mammalian species but it's based on lions rather than primates. So they look there. We've got a lot of points of sympathy, and yet they don't actually think like humans a lot of the time. The Hani have this matriarchal culture. It's very built around family prides. You can find analogies for it in human culture, but it really does work very, very differently. And you can start to play with that. But what are the points of connection? What does the reader admire in that alien species? And what is that? What are we reminded of? Can be useful questions to ask.
Yeah, touch points, places where we can actually make connections and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Van Aaron, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what Kat and Stant have said. I hate bright line rules, but I'm tempted to say that the aliens culture is the one thing you just can't avoid telling the reader something about. You can be very minimalist in terms of their biology and every other aspect, but there's hardly any point in having aliens in your story if you're not going to tell us a little bit about how their culture works and how they interact, regardless of what kind of story you're telling. If you're telling, even if it's a pretty light story, Stant mentioned David Brin before, Startide Rising has all these different alien races, and they're a hoot, but they're a hoot because you hear a little bit about how each race operates. And sometimes you don't know anything about what they look like or where they come from or anything, but you know that this species is very differential, this one is very aggressive, and that's what makes it fun when you keep jumping between these different races and you see how they approach problems differently. And I think you can't really get around that, and there's almost no point to writing the aliens in if you're not going to include that. If you have some metaphorical message you're exploring, it's not going to get anywhere if you can't see how these aliens work and how their society functions, and even if it's very silly. My story coming out in FNSF is about people playing the sport of curling with aliens. And I've got one paragraph describing what they look like and nothing else about the aliens because they're not the point of the story, except I take the time to talk about how much they're passionate about curling and how much it means to them, because otherwise, why have them there? I'm trying to think of an example where an author skips over that, and none is coming to mind.
This is all assuming that we're talking about sentient species where the aliens are characters, because
yeah, but even if they're not, or even if we suspect they're not, like think of George R.R. Martin's Sand Kings. For much of the story, you don't think the Sand Kings are sentient, and yet they have a culture, and they like have like this worshipful respect for the main character, and that's so crucial. He's not trying to teach us anything about alien biochemistry or anything. He's just trying to tell a spooky story, and it's effective. Part of the reason it's effective is you start to get a sense of how these little aliens work, and that's part of what makes it really creepy.
We've brought up David Brin a couple of times here, and it's one of the most magical things that science fiction can sometimes do. One of the things I remember most from that series, and I swear to God, I can never remember the name of the actual species. Maybe you guys do, and you can pop in and tell me. But there is a species that communicates primarily through projecting images above their heads. And I remember thinking, and they're highly metaphorical images. It's a language. And I remember thinking, oh, that's really cool at the time when I read it in the mid to late 90s. But now when I have a GIF keyboard on my phone and people communicate through memes all the time, I think about that species all the time and how we are literally evolving into it. So just this little aspect of culture from this random science fiction series, I read it in the 90s, I'm sure it didn't come out in the 90s, becomes something in the future. This is the magic of science fiction that actually has massive meaning to me. And I think about them all the time in terms of how much I rely on GIFs to now communicate my emotional state, and that I am becoming this alien species. So even those little aspects of culture can metamorphose into something truly amazing through just the great recipe of science fiction and time.
Absolutely. Gary, thoughts on culture?
Well, I think that one of the things a lot of readers don't realize is how much effort a writer has to put into coming up with a reasonable culture for aliens. But I think that's one of the fun parts of writing, in fact. And I think some of the chapters that are most fun to write are those written from the point of view of an alien, especially if you have taken the time to build up a reasonable background and so on. Of course, I'm older than most of the rest of you, but one of the early people who dealt a lot with aliens was Hal Clement. And I can remember being enamored by his stories about a race, for example, that developed on a Jupiter-like planet with an immensely heavy gravity and so on. And Clement spent a lot of time in the heads of his aliens and looking at things from their point of view, looking at humans from the point of view of an alien. And of course, recently, those discoveries on Venus of the chemicals that may indicate that there could be microscopic life, even in the clouds of Venus, bring up these ideas about what might happen if a species could develop in a totally different sort of environment than what we're used to. But yeah, I think that having a solid culture, doing the work to figure out exactly what the biology and the cultural relationships of the organisms that you're creating give you an opportunity then to do a lot of things, both have the reader look at things from a different point of view, for one thing, but it also gives you good opportunities for humor in showing the things that human beings do that are rather absurd sometimes. And you can point that up a little easier if you're looking at it from a naive point of view from another organism, another culture.
Excellent. For anybody who's not in chat, the question was asked what the culture in Rendezvous with Rama was, and Stamp threw down a very heady, interesting response that I like a lot. And he talks about the cylinder ship being a body in a mystery story, and we don't ever really get to figure out what that is because there's precious little that's shared about it definitively. And yeah.
Aliens don't appear in the first one, do they? In the first novel?
The reference there is specifically to the first novel, because of course we do learn more and more with sequels. That first book, The Wonder, is the wonder of the unsolved mystery. And there's also, we've been talking about a certain strain in science fiction, but there's also the new weird and the older antecedents of weird fiction, where actually the aliens are ultimately unknowable. And the wonder of the story is wrapped up in how the human characters deal with encountering the unknowable. And the question of when we encounter the unknowable, when we encounter the other that we don't understand, do we react with violence and fear, or do we react, with cosmic horror, or do we react with wonder and that desire to draw ever closer and learn more? One of my very favorite science fiction stories, where actually the alien's fascinating, but you never actually meet the alien or know much about its culture, but the yearning to know about its culture just invigorates the story, is Jorge Luis Borges's There Are More Things. And it's actually his gentle rebuke to H.P. Lovecraft and his homage to Lovecraft at the same time, because it's about a man in Brazil who one day a man in Argentina who one day decides to go check out that mansion up in the hill where all the neighbors have been saying that there's weird lights and sounds that come from it after nightfall. And he sneaks into his neighbor's house, and he's the invader in the house and the investigator and the detective, because this house is weirding him out, and none of the furniture fits a human shape. And he's trying to imagine what the body of this inhabitant is like. This is someone from beyond Aldebaran, he says. And finally, and it's written very much like a Lovecraft story, but then at the end, he has climbed up this ladder into an utterly alien room, and then he's climbed back down, and he hears footsteps behind him, but they're not human footsteps, these slithering footsteps coming toward him. And at that moment, he has a decision to make, because he feels the terror pounding in his heart, but his curiosity is stronger than his fear. So the last line of the story is that he turns toward the far door where the alien being is about to come through. And the last line of the story is, "And I did not close my eyes." And the reader never meets the alien, But the point of the story is the decision to meet the alien with curiosity and wonder rather than with terror. And there, just like in Rendezvous with Rama, it's a mystery. It's a mystery story. But the drama in both cases, whether you're reading a Lovecraft story of xenophobic cosmic horror, or the kind of pure wonder of Arthur C. Clarke, or the very reflective curiosity of of Borges, the magic of the story is grounded in the human's decision about how they're going to respond emotionally to the unknowable, and how is that connected to what makes us human. That is another thing you can do with science fiction that's quite magical.
Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts or stuff folks want to share?
I do think to sort of bring two of these concepts together is that, if you've thought through the biology, you can continue thinking logically to get straight to the culture. Again, biology informs everything that we do and everything that we are. And you can get some good world building out of it too. One of the bits in space opera is there's a whole discussion of how much harder aquatic species have it when it comes to getting to interstellar civilization, because they have to deal with, requiring this whole other environment to travel in space. So their ships have to contain water. They have to have environment suits. They have a whole lot more going on. It usually takes them a lot longer than species that can metabolize air. So, just that logical thing. Do you have an aquatic species? Well, how the hell did they get to space? Just that, very simple series of questions. And actually, if you are an aspiring writer, one of the best ways to deal with this stuff is talk to somebody else and let them ask you simple questions like that, like questions that you may not have thought about because it's all kind of complete in your head. And somebody outside can be like, oh, well, I mean, it's cool that you like have these space dolphins, but how does that work? Those kinds of very simple questions, and your instinctive response to them can really be informative for the very first building blocks of creating that species.
And don't just ask the how, ask the why too. Agree 100% with Kat. I'll then ask why. What drove them to go those extra miles to get into space? Like, why does that matter to them? Why is that their dream?
Right. It's all kind of like explorative anthropology, right? Like when I'm doing this sort of exercise, whether it's for a game or a novel, I build all of this from the largest picture world view, geology, geography, 1,000 tons of stuff that the reader will never really be exposed to. But for me to understand, like, what is the landscape? What are the environmental pressures that cause this sort of biology, and what culture comes out of that under those geographical circumstances? And that informs a lot of this stuff, and why they go where they go and how they get there and how quickly did they go. Were they able to take their time versus was it super rushed and it was an escape from something, figuring out all of those pressures and how that drives both the evolution of biology and culture. And that can really inform how they interact with the rest of the universe as well. So those are all super important things to keep in mind when you're dealing with alien cultures and races.
And especially avoiding that thing where, there's one species and one culture per planet.
Right.
That's not how that ever works. And competitive species fuel evolution.
Right.
So when you're thinking about, environment fueling biology, fueling culture, you have to think about a competitive environment. I think that what Stan's first comment was just like A++, like would listen again. It was really, really good, talking about the cost of every, interesting bit of evolutionary biology. Well, it does all have a cost, but like you really have to consider the whole primordial soup that would have created these species, and that there's going to be more species on their planet than whatever stands in for a dog for them, or they would never have had the pressure to evolve the particular unique traits that they have.
Exactly. So we have like 4 minutes left. Other stuff, Gary, what do you got?
I was just going to say, feeding off of something that Stan said too, I think one of the circumstances in which we as human beings end up not doing the most honorable things is when we look at fellow human beings as being other than human. And I think being able to look at alien species is not something to fear, but something to understand would apply on a much more personal basis if we can convince ourselves not to look at other cultures or other colors or other variations on a human theme as being something somehow less than human.
Absolutely.
I mean, look, our species has a real problem considering like the female gender of its own species as sentient and equal and worthy. This is actually, it's so funny listening to this conversation that it is the entire first chapter of Space Opera, not to toot my own horn, but I figure somebody else had slides. But the Fermi paradox is literally the first paragraph of the first chapter, and then discussing how we can't get it together on this planet even to consider anybody else the same species. And you have to deal with the fact that that is part of human nature, and very few of us are writing far enough future science fiction that you could conceivably think that that's been fixed. So that is part of the spice that goes into any kind of contact story.
I need to read Space Opera.
Right.
I think you would like it. Yeah.
Yes. I think
Just read an article the other day that suggested that social media may be the great filter for alien civilizations, and we may not be getting through okay.
Well, you know, it's funny. So I think of Twitter these days as kind of like Galaxia. What happens at the end of the Federation of the Foundation 6 books, except that we were just completely not ready for it. We were not ready to have a hive mind, and like we were not ready to be able to see everyone's everyday thoughts in this massive psychic fire hose. And we are right now psychologically evolving to deal with the fact that we got Galaxia way too soon.
Right.
And that is a huge part of the problem with what is happening with social media.
Okay, we got a minute left. What's your favorite species? Cat?
The one that I can't remember that has the images above there. I was on my phone trying to find it, and David Brin's website is not helpful enough, but I will find it eventually. I think it starts with a T.
Gary?
Oh, I guess I like Hal Clement's mesclinites.
Okay. Stan?
I have no idea how to
Do
pick.
it. Do it. You got one?
I've got a
all of them.
All of them.
all of them.
Van Aaron, yours favorite?
I've got. Well, someone mentioned the species in Ender's Game, but I've got a particular fondness for the Pequeños in the sequel, Speaker for the Dead. I love that.
Yeah.
And I do have a response. There was a chat comment about a book called Strangers about a human who marries an alien woman, but they don't really understand each other. And the commenter didn't remember the author. That's Gardner Dozois.
Cool. Hey, I just read in my last trip to Gen Con, which was way last year, but Werner Vinge's Fire Upon the Deep. I really enjoyed the Tyne as a alien species concept. That was pretty cool.
Oh, they were awesome.
Yes.
I got my answer. The aliens in Arrival. They're
Yeah.
my favorite.
The heptapods.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We don't know what they call themselves, but we did learn something about their drives and how, and it's remarkable.
It was a great balance between like the truly unknowable and the little tantalizing bits and pieces that we got.
Yes.
I think that the short story is the true, like that's what should be turned into films. That is the perfect pairing. Like the amount of information and the time you have in a feature film, like novels should be series, short stories should be feature films.
I agree 1,000%.
Yeah,
Like the 10 episode a season HBO series is the ideal format for adapting novels. Squeezing a novel into a film it doesn't work very often.
I say we start up a movement and see if we can make that happen. Cool. Well, I don't think we're being thrown out from the sounds of it, but that is technically our time. So I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank all the attendees for coming. We're all writers and authors of various things, so check out the websites and I hope
Timber Me, that's it. Timber Me.
Timber meat.
Somebody found it. It's the
Oh,
timber.
really? The practical joker species.
Yes.
Nice.
Oh, I forgot about the images. I love them. They're like the perfect wish
Thank you,
fulfillment
thank you.
alien species for a sci-fi author because they one of their like
The glyphs. Yes, yes, yes.
yeah, because and the glyphs, that's what it was. You're right, the Pretty, because they end up buying like massive amounts of sci-fi and fantasy from Earth because they think it's
Keith rules. Thank you, Keith.
Go Keith.
In at the buzzer.
Thank you, Keith.
Well, thanks
Thanks,
everybody.
Paul.
Have an awesome
Thanks,
day.
everyone. It's nice talking to everyone. Stant, you rule.
You rule too, Kat. I got to get your book.
Guys with the rest of the con. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.